The Super Nintendo was a beast of a console, and introduced what are still some of the greatest games in many long-running franchises. Games like The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, Super Mario World, Mega Man X, and of course Super Metroid all evolved their game structures for a new generation, using the more powerful hardware capable of, at the time, more complex controls and mind-blowing graphics. Also, Mode 7 was a thing. I love it, don't get me wrong, but some of that is a little rough to go back to. Super Metroid, though, relied very little on those kind of overly ambitious graphical gimmicks. It evolved the franchise in more subtle but still effective ways. The main improvement was also its most simple and obvious: a map. Whether due to the inclusion of more buttons or just an evolution in the mindset of the developers, the map was a total game changer, allowing for a more non-linear layout to the game where the only limit was your own skill, and the occasional hard block due to missing abilities. Super Metroid also defined many things about the not-yet-tokened search action genre, such as the ability to do things out of order if you're able to manipulate the environment successfully with your abilities. There was also a much more diverse roster of bosses that mostly relied on predictable attack patterns you needed to memorize to succeed, as opposed to the fairly generic missile sponges of the last two games. Throw in a drastically expanded arsenal of abilities to pick up throughout the game, and an improved return to the exploration structure from the first game, and you have all the makings of a classic game bound to be a system seller. Well, unfortunately, despite this game defining the childhood of many gamers and basically birthing the speedrunning community as we know it, it still landed on the Super Nintendo like a wet fart and caused the series to go dormant for 8 years. A large part of this was due to the game releasing toward the end of the Super Nintendo's lifespan, after the N64 had already been announced. But the system had a pretty good life between Super Metroid releasing in 1994 and the Nintendo 64 coming out in 1996, and many other successful games came out even later, like Donkey Kong Country 3 and Super Mario RPG, and those still managed to outsell Super Metroid by a lot. Was the game bad? Were people just not interested in the Metroid series? After all, the series was almost 10 years old at that point and only had 3 games. Well, let's dive in deeper and analyze this game and its legacy. Hello again! I told you next time we'd be covering the complex legacy of Super Metroid, and here we are. If you missed them, please check out my videos on the first 2 games in this series, as I'm going to be assuming you're knowledgeable on key elements of those. But for the rest of you, there is a lot to say about this game, so let's just jump into it. I feel like that intro summary was plenty of lead-in, and you'd much rather look at the game footage than my face. It's hard to get anywhere in a critique of this game without mentioning the technical leap it received thanks to the 16-bit hardware boost. As a kid, I dabbled with Metroid 1 on NES, but this sequel was already out by then, so it was more so as a comparison. I had a hard time going back to those 8-bit origins, despite loving the original Zelda and Mario games even after their SNES counterparts had released. Something about that NES Metroid game just felt less timeless. Right from the start, this is a more confident and technically impressive game, though, with brief voice acting, a mind-blowing if not harsh-sounding feature back then.
The last Metroid is in captivity. The galaxy is at peace.
As well as actual animated cutscenes explaining the story so far. Gone are the days of Metroid 1's bland and grammatically incorrect screen of text. This is the future! But it gets better. Instead of just being dropped into a planet without any direction, the game opens with Samus infiltrating a space station to rescue the last remaining Metroid baby she had contained in the last game after committing almost total species genocide on the planet. But lo and behold, she reaches the chamber with the baby Metroid and finds it's not alone. Her old nemesis Ridley is there, looking much more physically imposing than his pocket-sized NES counterpart. As a kid, this scared me because the game had just started. How can I fight him? Well, no matter how good you are, he takes the baby and flies away. I personally prefer to beat him, as he briefly drops the capsule and panics to get it again before flying off, rather than just leaving you nearly dead and flying off satisfied, but either way, it's the same outcome. Another twist of expectations as you get a warning, the space station will self-destruct, and you have to get out. Samus is still weak, but luckily there's no enemies or anything. You just fight the sometimes wonky platforming thanks to the Mode 7 effect, and rush back to the elevator out of there. Cue another at-the-time epic cutscene as the station explodes and Samus flies off in her ship to chase Ridley, who lands on a very familiar planet to her, Zebes. Yes, in some ways this game kind of does the Star Wars thing of using the third entry to retell the story of the first entry, but with way more budget, ambition, and confidence. But to call this game a retread of the first does it a disservice. It follows the same basic structure of taking out the main bosses blocking access down to Torian, and then killing all the Metroids as well as Mother Brain, but that's about where the comparisons end. Every area has been remade and expanded since part of Zebes was all but destroyed, and a whole slew of new creatures have moved in, opened new pathways, etc. There's also some new areas to explore, such as the eerie and haunted ghost ship and the confusing underwater maze of Meridia, each with tough bosses of their own in addition to the returning Kraid and Ridley in Brinstar and Norfair, respectively, as well as a series of mini-bosses throughout the game that vary in quality. But anyway, you land on the surface of the planet, newly dubbed Criteria, years before Zero Mission would introduce that area into the lore of the original. From here, it's business as usual for our beloved bounty hunter as she tries to go right, but it's blocked because, once again, she is completely depowered for no reason. Add it to the Federation stockpile. Following the path left down the only area you have access to leads down into another really great moment. Essentially backtracking through the destroyed remains of old Torian from the first game. This moment is sufficiently creepy, but it didn't really register as a kid because I'd never beaten the first game. But now I really appreciate how cool it is as you pass right through the broken shards of Mother Brain's containment chamber and down to Brinstar, recreating the opening moments of the original game. It's a brilliant callback that also wordlessly helps explain how the planet has expanded. They didn't retcon anything, you're just exploring other areas that were probably rearranged from the seismic activity of Torian's destruction. But yeah, the homage is fully brought home when you find the morph ball in the exact same spot. It seems a little weird and contrived at first, but then a spy camera of some kind lights up and watches you leave, implying that maybe this key item was placed here to notify the space pirates under the employ of Ridley. So yeah, super suspicious surveillance, but nothing happens, so you move on. Missiles are also waiting just down the hall, and then another dead end. Guess Brinstar isn't as big as it used to be. Time to backtrack up through Old Torian again, knowing there's new areas to access. Space pirates? We've been had! Luckily, these are just the wimpy foot soldiers mostly here for effect, and Samus easily dispatches them on her way back to the surface. I think they were intended more as a scare tactic. Warn Samus she's stepping on space pirate turf. But yeah, if we don't speed this recap along, this video will be longer than an actual run of Super Metroid. Which, to be fair, isn't actually that long, but that's not the point. One more quick pit stop to pick up bombs, and then we have proper access out of critique. Wait, what? The Chozo statues can fight back? But that's illegal! Again, it almost feels like this game frames her power-ups as being placed around the planet to trap Samus. Not a very good trap, because they're literally making her stronger and more capable before they try to kill her, but hey, we already established the space pirates aren't the brains of this operation. That's right, folks, callback joke. It's still not funny, but at least it's a reward for people that actually watched the other videos. So, you're welcome? But yeah, this is another surprising twist, as Samus is trapped in a room with a seemingly living Chozo statue, and she has to basically kill a remnant of her family in order to progress. So she does that, because Samus doesn't make a big deal about family. Dom Toretto could learn a thing or two from her.
You've heard me say that you never turn your back on family. And I want to thank you all for never turning your back on me.
With bombs in hand, Samus can now reach Brinstar. Again. But this isn't your Mother Brain's Brinstar. First off, the music kicks in and it just slaps. I love this tune, even if Nintendo copyright flags me every time I use it in a video. But secondly, it looks noticeably different from the traditional blue Brinstar we saw before. Now it's overgrown, wild green, and full of life. It looks mostly untouched by external forces, except for the fact that there's a few weird rooms with mechanized door barriers and other out-of-place technology. But hey, it's a video game. They don't care. This is also where the cracks start to show with the map system, in my opinion. See, this is the first Metroid game with a map, so it was a huge first step, but it's also an extremely simple first step. When you explore a room, it shows up as pink. If you find the map station for that area, it highlights the rest as blue, indicating you haven't been there before. Rooms with hidden items in them have a white dot, but not every room with hidden items. Sometimes there's no dot, so it's a surprise that there's still something there. And unlike later entries where it goes from an open circle to a closed dot, there's no different indicator if you've gotten the item or not, which can make it hard to remember if you've been to a room and seen you didn't have the power you need to get the item. This map layout is so simple it doesn't even mark doors or barriers. It distinguishes between what is a door versus a wall, but even then there's exceptions because of pesky one-way barrier doors that gate off access from the wrong side, so you might think you can go through, but you have to wrap around the map a different way because of an arbitrary progress blocker. A more modern game, like Metroid Dread for example, mediates that by having progress blockers that are permanently moved once you use the required item on them. So when backtracking, that's not an issue anymore. Plus that map is just way more detailed. Here, if there's a super missile switch door, for example, you have to hit it from the correct side every time you want through. There are some tricks around that, but I'll talk about that kind of thing later. The point is, while having a map is a massive improvement, the map itself is fairly lackluster. I think this is as good a time as any to explain that I actually replayed this game using a modded quality of life ROM called Super Metroid Redux. It has some other key changes I'll detail in a bit, but one major improvement is how it handles the map. It actually color codes doors to help you remember what's what for backtracking purposes. It also now properly displays every room with items, including the few that have multiple hidden items in them. It goes a long way toward replayability, and is basically the whole reason I was finally able to 100% complete this game after like 20 years of casual runs. The only thing that sucks is you can't use it in conjunction with randomizers, because I have a hard time playing the game without those quality of life improvements now, but I also love randomizer runs. Anyway, with all that out of the way, we're still in Brinstar. As much as I love the music and atmosphere here, I actually kind of hate exploring it. There's very few convenient paths through, so you end up seeing a lot of the same rooms during repeat backtracks between Criteria and Norfair, for example. Also, similar to Zero Mission, the routing during this early part of the game kinda sucks. The way you're expected to go basically has you exploring through Brinstar to get the Charge Beam, though it is missable, and then the Super Missiles after a very bland sub-boss, and then the Phaser Beam, which is also missable and technically intended to get later. Then you're directed down to Norfair with only a tease of a giant, gross monster head staring you in the face that you can't yet jump high enough to reach. So yeah, once in Norfair, most rooms are too hot to enter. Basically, the only path you can go through gets you the high jump boots. Remember that monster face? Yeah, now you can go in. That's all you can do down here. I like it from the standpoint of teasing what lies ahead, but in general, I don't like being routed to a new area just to get one thing and then go back. But whatever, back up, jump into the monster mouth, and keep running. You get another tease at a future area by way of a glass tube protecting you from the watery depths of Meridia, and this is a much more effective bit of foreshadowing. You basically get 3 rooms and the name of the place, and the knowledge that right now you're basically useless in water, so that must change before you actually go to that place, and then you're back in Brinstar. The map shows a large and ominous boss room coming up soon, and this section of map looks very similar to the lead up to Kraid in the first Metroid game, so it's pretty easy to guess that's no coincidence, especially when you see the little fake Kraid start spitting needles at you. Another nice callback that seems to imply maybe the baby Kraid you fought in the first game also wasn't the real one. Like, it's a whole species of varying size, kind of like how goldfish will grow to fit the size of their containers. Anyway, the atmosphere here is already cool and evocative, but then you reach a creepy eye door and see a rotting Federation trooper getting munched on by bugs, and you just know that shit is about to get real. Whatever is behind that door must be serious business. Waiting on the other side is a much larger Kraid, with a belly that takes up most of the screen, and a weak point in his mouth that can only be reached by jumping or aiming diagonally. It's a strong first showing for a major boss that really sets itself apart from anything in the past 2 games. Except maybe the Metroid Queen in Metroid 2. That was actually a very technically impressive fight on the Game Boy. But wait, there's more! After a few shots in Kraid's mouth, he gets angry and rises up out of the ground, taking his weak spot with him out of your reach. The rest of the fight requires high jumping up to precarious platforms and aiming carefully while avoiding stray fingernails and belly button spikes. Man, Kraid is gross. But finally taking him out means you get access to the Varia suit behind him. The game doesn't explain what it does, because this is another one where you're just expected to read things in the manual, but longtime fans know it protects against extreme heat, and newcomers would be able to figure out that they can't go anywhere else but back to Norfair. So either past knowledge or context clues would set you up to continue exploring those heated rooms in Norfair that would have killed you before. Time for some more kind of awkward routing, as you loop around Norfair multiple times picking up items that each get you access to the next one. If you do it in the intended order, that is. There's still some debate about the intended way the game expects you to go, but regardless, you have to pass through the only heated section you can, as the others require items you don't have or are otherwise gated, and reach a green bubble area very reminiscent of Norfair from the first Metroid game. Here, you wrap around through the maze and a bunch more rooms until you eventually find an item new to this game, the Speed Booster. Once again, the game is unclear on what it does, but immediately puts you in a trial and error situation to figure it out as you run as fast as you now can through a room filling with lava and back out to the green bubble area. From here, you're expected to go back to the elevator area of Norfair and into the room that gated you off with fast-closing pistons. Now you can speed through them and find a door on the other side, as well as some blocks for an item you don't have. Head on through and up to a lava room with enemies and a morph ball hole you can't reach, and context tells you there's probably an item nearby that solves this puzzle. Enemies in the previous room can be seen disappearing into a morph ball hole. Follow them and you reach the ice beam, which freezes enemies and turns them into temporary platforms. Great! More non-verbal puzzle clues. Back up and out that lava room using your new platform-making tool, and you land back in the mechanical hallway with the speed boost pistons and mysterious bomb blocks. A bit of aimless exploring later, and you drop down into a long, flat room with a red Kraid?
Oh, shit! Whoa, where you going? That is a red one!
This is Crocomire, one of the most infamous Metroid sub-bosses ever made, and for good reason. He's a very unique boss fight in that you can shoot him as much as you want and he won't die. But with every hit in the mouth, he takes a few stumbling steps back, until you finally knock him off the platform to his gruesome death, tug-of-war style, and you just have to stand there and watch him burn away down to just a bubbly skeleton. It's graphic for the Super Nintendo, and for a kid's game. Samus continues onward and bam! Runs right into a spike wall. Subtle environmental clues say that you're stuck here, but you can also see bubbling, moving lava under you. By the time you exhaust all options to try to get around the wall, Dry Crocomire busts through the spikes like a skeletal Kool-Aid man, which gave me more nightmares as a kid than I'm willing to admit. Luckily, it harmlessly collapses into a pile of bones nearby and your path forward is cleared. You do more wandering, and you eventually end up in a tall room with a Chozo statue holding the grapple beam. And it's here where the cracks in the controls start to show. The Super Nintendo controller was a huge improvement over the old NES brick that felt more like an 80s arcade pad. It featured a squishy D-pad, 4 face buttons, L&R triggers, and good old start and select. That's an extra 4 buttons to play with total, but a lot of games didn't really know what to do with them all. Usually just relegating shoot and jump to multiple buttons, and using L&R to quick toggle menu options. Super Metroid handled the controller pretty successfully though. There was a dedicated button for running that also activated the speed booster, and L&R allowed Samus to aim diagonally for the first time. Unfortunately, it was less successful at juggling the rest of her arsenal. In past games, Select would toggle between missiles and regular beam. A little clunky, but totally manageable. Now, Select still toggles weapons, but you have missiles, super missiles, and grapple beam, as well as power bombs and X-ray visor you'd soon obtain. There was a quick deselect button that came in handy for switching back to your beam, but having to quickly mash select to actually switch over to other powers got old very quickly, especially since it was just one way. So if you mash too quickly, you might miss and have to cycle all the way back around. Even on the Super Nintendo, it was clunky, and it's easily the thing that's aged worst about the game. Especially when you factor in how some powers were context sensitive, such as power bombs only working when you were in Morph Ball, and grapple beam only being used to aim at specific blocks and enemies. Combine that with the fact that I frankly just hate the grapple beam in this game, and a lot of frustrations come to light around this part in the adventure. Especially if you'd already gotten the power bombs and X-ray visor by the time you get the grapple beam, which is totally possible. I will note here before continuing with how much the grapple sucks that the controls are another major improvement in the Redux mod though. It retools things to work much more similarly to the GBA games, where power bombs are toggled on and off in Morph Ball mode, R activates whatever missile you have selected, and the X-ray visor is actually on its own button so you don't have to select it at all. Select is still required to toggle between missile, super missile, and grapple, so it's not a perfect system, but the fact that you can keep one selected and still shoot your beam makes all the difference, as you just hold a button to switch your beam to missile or grapple, and then release the button to resume your normal shot. It cuts down a lot of that tedious select navigation, and while it doesn't make the grapple beam any less clunky to actually use, it does mean it's not such a chore to activate. But that all being said, I still hate the item. It's mostly optional if you're good at sequence breaking skills, so you can usually get around having to use it, but we're going over actual intended progress right now, so it's worth noting how important it is for getting around during this part of the game. But yeah, it has a little tutorial too, as you need it to get out of the room, and you can immediately tell how awkward the momentum of it is. You basically aim and shoot at blocks, and then release the shot and aim at the next one to kind of bunny hop your way over pits and stuff. But then they throw complications like enemies that can disengage you, or crumbling blocks that break if you don't swing away fast enough, and the actual aiming is clunky since it's just 45 degrees or straight up, so navigating anywhere with it is an exercise in frustration. Especially considering it's usually over lava, or pits, or You know, the kind of obstacles that prevent you from being able to get past it without the grapple beam. But yeah, you need it to get the next fairly optional beam upgrade somewhat nearby. On the way to the speed booster, you might have found a strange room with dropping platforms, a beam barrier, and a pit of spikes with grapple blocks over it. Now, you can go back there and grapple across to the room with the wave beam, which lets your shot pass through walls, allowing you to open those beam barriers from either side. Still not the super missile barriers, though, unless you're a pro gamer like me.
Got it! Oh, that was beautiful.
Told you we'd come back to that. But yeah, with that final Norfair upgrade, for now, you're able to backtrack out and up the elevator to Bristol, where you can finally escape back up that long pit you fell down. Though I'll admit freezing all those turtle things to get out is super annoying and I wish there was a better way. At the top of the column of map is a new area you can reach that takes you back to the surface. But there's a yellow door you can't penetrate. Must have missed something. Check the branching doors on the way up and you find a hidden path down to a Chozo statue holding the power bombs, which you quickly discover can be used to open yellow doors. So yeah, back up to the surface to an area the map will tell you is right of your ship where you couldn't previously reach. Before we go any further though, I want to go back and explain what I meant about sequence breaking the intended order here, as it seems like everyone has their own order for getting the items scattered across Norfair, and I think it's a perfect example of non-linear progression in this game. The way I explained the order of items is the way I generally did things as a kid, and what's always made the most sense to me. Technically, you can go up to Brinstar and get the power bombs after you get the ice beam, and then take out that power bomb barrier by the ice beam room down to Crocomire, but going almost up to the surface just to drop back down that pit and head back to Norfair seemed like a waste of time to me, even if it does let you grab the X-ray visor too on the way back down. With some light sequence breaking, however, you can basically get any of those Norfair items in any order. I tend to still start with the speed booster because I'm not good at the mock ball trick needed to get ice beam first. But if you're able to start with the ice beam, you can then freeze the enemies in the bubble room near speed booster to cross that gap, grab speed booster without all the wrapping around, and then go down that area backwards. Make a quick pit stop at the weird room I mentioned with the wave beam, and do a tricky wall jump over the spike pit to reach the wave beam room without grapple, then head down to Crocomire. Build up your speed here, and you can skip another grapple block section to reach a random power bomb upgrade, which is the equivalent of collecting power bombs since they all count the same as acquiring the item, unlike how it works in Metroid Dread. From there, you get the grapple beam on the way out, and voila! Basically one loop around Norfair and you got all those items and saw a lot less of the same rooms over and over again. From there, you go back up the elevator, grab the X-ray visor on the way up if you want, collect what was supposed to be the first power bomb, and then head up to the surface. And really the only trick required is nailing that wall jump for early wave beam. Unless you want to figure out how to do the mock ball to get ice beam first, but I spent more time trying to do it than I even saved. There's so many options. And that's just scratching the surface of sequence breaking, since I don't mess with a lot of the more complicated things, like getting early super missiles and completely skipping that dumb plant sub-boss. Technically anyone that's wall jumped up to get Spacer Beam before high jump boots has dabbled in basic sequence breaking. You can even reach Kraid before going to Norfair, cutting down on that random quick trip for high jump boots. It's never been a big deal to me, and that extra energy and missile tank you get down there too is very useful. But if you're the type to do randomizers, like I have, knowing these options for reaching items out of order really helps when you could possibly go the whole game without the high jump boots, for example. Sequence breaking is a huge part of the game though, and why it's so infinitely replayable, and it's been a lot of fun to learn different tricks over the years. I love that it's a game where you don't need any insane skills to get everything, but if you know them, they make the game easier to navigate. Whereas, like I said in the past, I think later games like Zero Mission took advantage of players knowing those skills and made them required to get all the items. In Super Metroid, you can go the entire game without even learning how to Shine Spark, much less being required to use it. And the only place that not knowing how could get you stuck is the area where a tutorial animal teaches you how to do it. That's smart game design. Give players the tools, but don't force anyone to use them. Wall jumping isn't even required at any point, though it's strongly encouraged if you want to get around without as much reliance on the grapple beam. Which I do. But yeah, with that little backtrack out of the way, let's get back to where we left off. Samus is on the surface of Criteria, heading right to what the map called a wrecked ship. You might speculate this is the crashed Ceres station, but no. It's been here far longer, and Zero Mission's postgame actually has you briefly explore it on the way to the space pirate ship in the area dubbed Chozodia. So the implication is more so that this ship belonged to the Chozo that originally occupied Zebes. Anyway, I just thought that was a fun fact because this is a mysterious place without much lore tied to it in this game, aside from the various Chozo statues and other visual details. But yeah, getting in kind of sucks, since the area is partially flooded and navigating water is not fun without the gravity suit, and you're expected to use the grapple beam to get across each gap over to the ship's entrance, or basically trudge through the water and start over. I prefer to just pick up speed and Shine Spark across the whole thing. Did I mention I hate using the grapple beam? Inside, the ship is without power and ominously haunted. None of the doors work, so you can't even save here, which is evil, by the way. Games shouldn't do that. And the only path you can go down leads to a boss room. Why is that one door energized, though? Another trap, perhaps? In the one room you can enter, you find a gross ghost thing with a large central eye. The early game progress gate would tell you this is another major boss. And this one is new to the series and named Phantoon. It's been sapping all the energy from the ship and presumably sees Samus as another good energy source. And man, this was such a tough boss as a kid. It still is, honestly, but once you get the pattern down, it's more so just time-consuming than anything. I did learn a tip recently, though. Don't use super missiles on this guy. He has a pretty predictable set of patterns if you just stick to missiles and dodge his ghost fire, waiting for his eye to open so you can pelt him. But if you hit him with a super missile, he goes into rage mode and flings nearly unavoidable ghost fire whips at you while angrily looming over the middle of the room. It led to so many deaths growing up, which, again, the last point you could have saved is either at your ship or a room in Brinstar before going to the surface, so it almost broke me before save states were a thing. But now he's not so bad, and he's one of the more memorable bosses since you have to watch the pattern and wait for an opening. Unlike Ridley, for example, who you just kind of missile spam to death. But yeah, with Phantoon destroyed, the ship's power is restored and you can freely explore. This area is actually pretty cool, but it's also one of the more frustrating places because it wraps you around to parts of Criteria and back in. And there's multiple spots that just drop you back to the surface, so you have to traverse back through the ship again and find another way. It's kind of mean. I always hate doors that go nowhere. Once you find the right way, though, you get the one new and very important upgrade the ship holds: the gravity suit. With that, you can make it through the underwater Death Spike room and out the other side of the ship. This area is still flooded, but luckily it's no problem, because water is Samus's bitch now. So you make it through another confusing morph ball maze and then into an elevator room that goes down to the area you just briefly glimpsed earlier, Meridia, also known as the bane of most players' existence. Let me preface this by saying I've always had a soft spot for Meridia. Maybe it's because it's where you get the space jump, or it's just because the atmosphere is so cool that I don't mind how frustrating it is to explore, but yeah, I do also understand the issues here. The area is not laid out well, with tons of places that only go one way and require you to basically wrap all the way around again to get back to where you started. And some of that comes from quicksand pits that you don't even know will drop you, since only a few are pits, and the rest just slow you down and make jumping hard. but the whole area can be kind of broken down into 3 distinct biomes. If you come down from the elevator, you start in the sort of sandy aquarium-looking area with a sealed door and a lot of hungry-looking fish. There's not really much here, mostly dead ends, so your only real path is through a pipe that gives you a hint of the rest of the area, including what looks like Metroids, and then drops you to the other end of Meridia. Here, you see you're fairly close to that glass bridge you saw early on, but actually getting around this section sucks. Between the quicksand and the confusing one-way tunnels, a first-timer would be kinda screwed without the X-ray visor. You can notice enemies coming and going through certain walls, though, Super Metroid's favorite way to hint at hidden paths, so you follow it out to that glass tube, and what now? There's seemingly no other way around to that underwater portion. Thinking back, I have no idea how you're supposed to know that you can destroy this tube with a power bomb, aside from just trial and error, but you can. It's so second nature now that I don't even think about it, but yeah, it's one of the more obtuse moments in the game. Anyway, the tube shatters and somehow water doesn't flood the whole bottom half of Brinstar, but hey, that's where suspension of disbelief comes in. This gives you free access to another section, which has more of a moss-covered bottom of the ocean feel. This area is much more open, but just as tricky to get around, due to a lot of small platforms and space pirates hiding in alcoves that can't seem to be damaged by anything you have. And there's also tiny blocks to grapple and swing on to other tiny platforms or risk falling into those space pirate pits. After a few attempts to reach an exit platform, though, you can get to the third and final section of this area. Pink. It's so pink. I don't know why, but I can only think of this area as what it is. Pink. This part looks noticeably more man-made and industrial, including what looks like containment chambers for Metroids that don't quite look like Metroids. Again, the game doesn't give any specific lore, but they're called Mocktroids and are implied to be experiments that space pirates are doing here. Probably trying to breed their own type of Metroids, if the similar experiments happening in the Prime series are any indication. That stuff all happened canonically before this, technically, so it would make sense. But anyway, despite all the pink, I think this section is the highlight of Meridia because it's more fun to navigate. At least if you get good at wall jumping instead of needing to deal with the grapple spots on the walls. You might notice I haven't talked about any item upgrades in this area, and that's because you don't get much. I have good nostalgia for this place, but it feels very tacked on compared to the rest of the game, now that I think about it. It's like they weren't sure how to explain the planet from just Brinstar and Norfair, so the pacing is kind of off after this still slow but kind of exciting trip through the wrecked ship. There are a lot of ammo expansions and energy tanks hidden around here, so that's something to encourage exploration at least. But after you make it through Pink and beat a laughably easy sub-boss Snick, it's a quick run to the next major boss, named Dragon. I've always called this boss Mama, which makes it even more tragic when you murder her and watch her kids swarm the body. And I assume eat her? Let's go with that. But yeah, this is another interesting fight. It's very much a missile sponge, but there's some nuance to it at least, as it swoops into the battlefield and sometimes spits out sticky webs to catch you and pierce you with her stinger. She can be pretty tedious to take down, but there's also a trick to it. Another thing I didn't know as a kid. There are energy turrets on each side of the battlefield, and if you shoot the cover off and then lure her near one while she holds you, you can grapple beam the electrified wall plate and basically burn her alive by channeling electricity through her body. It's such a badass moment for Samus, and also makes the boss fight a piece of cake. But most importantly, it's the only thing that makes the grapple beam worth getting. And yes, I know you can only reach the optional spring wall upgrade by destroying a grapple block, but I stand by what I said. I love things like this, and the thing I told you about Fantoon, where he's harder if you use super missiles. Those kinds of tricky things that help you fight bosses easier, and also give little secrets for being creative. Anyway, you burn her to death, and her babies enjoy some Dragon barbecue. And the next room is the space jump boots, which makes getting out of Meridia infinitely more enjoyable. It's mostly why I have fond memories of this area. It's not that long, and zooming around it with space jump is fun. But we're not done here yet. After a slow run through the whole area, you get space jump, like I said, which leads you to the spring ball, unless you got it early by using the wall jump. And then, if you head out the sandy section, you can see the previously blocked door is now flashing and accessible. Inside is another beam upgrade that I guess is also theoretically missable, the plasma beam. I can't imagine going without it against some of the hard end enemies, but the game never forces you to go back out that way, since you can also leave out the shattered glass tube. But yeah, the pacing here is kind of off again, as you go basically the whole area with no power suit upgrades, and then pick up 3 pretty quickly after the boss. It's just something worth noting in the whole "this area is awkwardly paced" argument from earlier. Side note before we move on, how great is the sequence leading to the spring ball? Everything in the game tells you to kill all enemies, but no, you need that one. Powerbomb destroys the wall in front of you, but doesn't touch the enemy or the sand. But your new friend can help. Just hang out behind, let it open the path, and then move on. And maybe kill your friend. He can still hurt you after all. But it's great that the game tempts you to ignore Samus's genocidal tendencies for a few seconds while you use the enemy to your advantage for progress. But yeah, 3 of the 4 bosses down. We're in the endgame now. You might have stumbled across another eerie monster mouth before in Norfair, indicating another boss arena, but you wouldn't have been able to get through the lava before. Now, with the gravity suit and the space jump at your disposal, it's a piece of cake and you can reach another elevator that takes you deeper into Norfair. This is another area that can be very easy to get lost in if you don't check everything, and one room in particular just feels unnecessary. It's just a hallway with monitors, some kind of security room, maybe, and it includes 2 enemies that aren't anywhere else in the game. Probably because they're awful and the game didn't want to make you fight them more than once. They're impervious to everything you have, making you think it's the wrong way, but you're locked in. As a kid, I thought I was soft-locked, but this game doesn't do that. Instead, you have to wait for them to do this jump kick move that changes them from gray to gold, and only when they're gold can they take damage. It's stupid, and there's 2 of them to keep track of. They're not that hard once you get the pattern down, but they're just really not fun and slow the whole game down to a halt, especially if you're trying to speedrun. After that, you find another empty Chozo statue, similar to the one in the wrecked ship, and when you ball up in its hand, it drains the lava below. Down there is another trap though, as a powerful gold Chozo gets the drop on you, and it can catch and counter your missiles. It's still easy to cheese through if you have enough ammo, but that at least makes the fight kind of special and adds some strategy to the mini-boss. Also, anyone always want to say chorizo instead of chozo? Or accidentally order a chozo taco at a Mexican place? Just me? Alright, moving on. After that, you finally get the screw attack, and the rest of the game is basically broken. Nothing can stop you. They're all screwed. The rest of this area is a bit of a maze, as it's fairly easy to get lost and miss the path to Ridley entirely, but considering that's your only reason for coming down here, and the boss chamber is marked on your map, you'll know pretty quickly if you're headed the wrong way. Though that doesn't make having to wrap around to the right way any more fun. This game really loves gating off progress with one-way passages. But once you reach Ridley's chamber, the encounter itself is pretty anticlimactic, unfortunately. After you're introduced to him in the beginning, it seems like he should be an endgame threat, but he's arguably the easiest boss to beat. He has a distinct attack pattern, but you never really have to worry about it since he's a large target that's almost all hitbox, so you can just spam missiles in his general direction and they'll probably hit. Unlike past bosses with specific weak points, but the only part of him that can't be hit is his tail. It is really cool how he changes color throughout the fight, so you can see when he's bright red that he matches the game's box art, indicating he must have been badly wounded there too. But overall, the battle is generic and there's not much spectacle. When he's dead, the room nearby opens and you go in expecting some awesome final upgrade. But nope, The room is empty, aside from a broken glass container and a secret energy tank. Could this be the one the baby Metroid was in? What happened to it? Only one way to find out. With all the boss locks destroyed, the strange barrier chamber in Criteria is opened, and the whole thing crashes down to an elevator below. Turns out Torian isn't gone for good. Either the space pirates rebuilt it, or there was always a larger space that didn't all get destroyed. But yeah, time to blow up another Death Star. It might be a new Torian, but it's got the same issues. This one isn't quite as bad, or as long, but freezing and shooting Metroids is still not fun. Especially in the regular game, when you have to select missiles and then switch back to beam. Redux wasn't so bad, but you can only improve this section so much. This whole final area is more plot development than a legitimate threat, though, and I feel like the Metroids are only here as an homage. And because the game is called Metroids, you have to put them somewhere. But, surprisingly, the area isn't all about cold genocide this time, as you run into an eerily empty room full of debris and enemy remains. You barely have time to process what any of it means before the once baby Metroid swoops into the room, now bigger than any you've seen for some unexplained, but probably sciencey reason, and it sucks your life force down to almost nothing. In a final moment of clarity, the giant Metroid seems to recognize its connection to Samus and stops, and then flies away, leaving Samus weak and nearly dead. Luckily, the next room has a recharge station in it, and then there's a brief final stretch leading into the very familiar chamber housing Mother Brain. Once again, is this same one somehow? A clone? Or, as other games have implied, Mother Brain is not one sole creation, more of a group of genetic creations built by space pirates to manage their day-to-day operations, like a biological supercomputer. Whatever she is, the fight still sucks. First phase is an homage to Zero Mission, but stupidly easy, and then she surprisingly doesn't die, but the chamber explodes and she rises up with a gross robotic body. Her only weak spot is her head, but thanks to the inclusion of diagonal aiming, that weak spot is insanely easy to hit, and she's dead before you know it. Wait, no, that's not how the fight goes. No matter how well you do, she ends up freezing Samus in place and slowly whittling down her health to nothing. Just in time for the once baby Metroid to swoop in again like the Deus Ex Machina it is. It gives Mother Brain that good suck and leaves her an empty husk of brain matter before transferring that energy to Samus. Not only bringing her back to life, but imbuing her with Mother Brain's power. Unfortunately, it didn't double tap the brain and she zombies back up to kill the Metroid, weakened by its transfer of energy to Samus. As tragic as that all is, with Samus's once biggest enemy sacrificing itself to save her, after she murdered all its friends, the final phase of the fight is essentially a playable cutscene. The Metroid energy gives Samus a powerful hyper beam attack that rips through Mother Brain and apparently everything else. The battle ends and Torian is left unstable again, so Samus has to frantically use her new rainbow powers to make her escape before the planet explodes. Again. The escape is pretty basic, but it is cool how you can see where new Torian connects to old Torian, and there's also a surprise little detour you can make on the way out to save the tutorial animals. It doesn't do much, but it's a fun Easter egg, and I kinda wonder how it was originally discovered. Before the internet, of course. Anyway, Samus returns to her ship, flies off the planet, and watches it explode in her rear view. And if you look closely, you can see the animals escape too, which I guess implies that they had some kind of escape pod of their own, and are capable of activating and flying said pod. Very impressive for creatures that would have just died in that room if we hadn't rescued them. But yeah, then you can just enjoy the final splash screen with completion stats, because they weren't displayed anywhere else in the game. Except in the Redux mod where you can see completion percentage on the inventory screen, so that's neat. Also, I wasn't lying about getting 100%, I just went back and got the rest of the items after recording. This was still my best unassisted completion run to date though, even before going back for the rest. I'm pretty proud of it. So yeah, that's Super Metroid. I know I structured this critique a little differently from the others, but I was really struggling with what to even say about this game, so doing a play-by-play was the only way to formulate my thoughts. You have to understand, this game is my childhood, and it's a masterpiece even despite some of the control issues, as well as the wonky physics I didn't really even touch on that much. Like I said, all that stuff is fixed in the Redux mod, with physics closer to the weight and gravity of the GBA games and much looser space jump timing that can be restarted mid-air if you cancel it. So those aren't issues I had in this recorded run. But there's still serious signs of how dated the game is to go back to, and why I struggled to critique it fairly. To me, I'm used to those issues, or know how to remedy them, and have mostly memorized or sequence broke the item routing in a way that cuts down on backtracking. But for first-time players, I'd imagine it's extremely easy to get lost, and frustrating to find the way around with how many times you go back and forth between Brinstar and Norfair just to get anywhere else. Add that in with the overly simple and just sometimes incorrect map screen, and this game is very much a relic of its time. But it was still revolutionary, if not still a bit obtuse, for its time, so it mostly holds up well, proven more by how little modding is needed to modernize it. And I'd still choose to play it any day over Zero Mission or Samus Returns, because the map layout and progression makes way more sense than either of those, and the pacing is quick and satisfying, especially if you get items out of order in Norfair. Meridia is still hit or miss, though. That area is divisive at best. The game is far from perfect, and next video I'll talk about why I enjoy Fusion more, but every time I play this game, despite the flaws, it feels like coming home. There's just a comfort to it. It's also the only Metroid game I'd gotten 100% in before Dread came out, because it's pretty quick to get through, so I never feel annoyed doing it again, and I learn more about where items are every time, so I've just kind of gotten closer and closer until I finally got everything. That's why I love randomizers of it. Knowing where everything is means I have a pretty good chance of completing a random run, and it encourages me to get better at sequence breaking skills, which helps future runs. There's a reason the speedrunning community for this game is so big. If you can get past the weird controls and heavy physics, this is a game that just never gets old to replay. It's kinda sad that I'll never get to know again what it's like to experience it for the first time. Like, if it's too obtuse to figure out without help. Though it was enlightening to watch Maximilian Dude do a blind run so I could see how much I take for granted just because I already know where things are, so I assume they're obvious.
Actual dead end?
Or maybe he's just bad at the game. I guess those are both possibilities. Super Metroid Redux proved that the game doesn't need a remake, just a bit of polish and mechanical updating for modern audiences. But it also solidified the game's status as a timeless classic. It doesn't ever hold your hand, but it does a perfect job at wordlessly guiding your way if you pay enough attention. And while I like later games like Fusion that add more story elements in between the open exploration, I think what makes Super so replayable is its minimalistic presentation. Compare 20 minutes of gameplay in Super to 20 minutes of gameplay in Dread, for example, and you see how much more time is spent on dialogue, cutscenes, and loading screens. There's nothing wrong with any of that, though I could do without the loading screens, but if I have 2 hours to spend on a game, I'd rather play the one I can beat in the one sitting. And they don't really make them like that anymore. Super Metroid is one of a kind. I'm just glad that time has been good for its legacy now, since it wasn't appreciated by enough people at its release. Whew. In case you couldn't tell by the extended runtime of this video, I had a lot to say about this game. Part of it is nostalgia, sure, I tried to make that clear from the start, but a bigger part of it is just the impact this game has had on me and the gaming landscape at large. Not to mention being the start of the search action genre in general. I will never get used to that phrase, though. It'll always be Metroidvania to me. I'm just specifying because that wasn't a term yet in 1994. Castlevania wouldn't make the shift to search action-style games until Symphony of the Night in 1997, and even then it wasn't consistent yet. But way before that, Metroid defined nonlinear progression in video games, and Super Metroid redefined it. It hasn't aged as well as the GBA titles, but I will always sing its praises for its legacy. I hope you'll let me know what you think of it too, whether you also played it on the Super Nintendo or never checked it out into the Switch Online service and had to compare it to the newer, more polished titles that came after it. And speaking of those games, I hope you'll join next time when I gush over the brilliance that is Metroid Fusion. I've done whole videos on that game before, so it'll be a little tricky to phrase my words to try to not repeat myself, but it's also dense with lore and new mechanics, so I'll have fun analyzing the nuance of my love for it. See you next mission. Time to backtrack out through Old Torian again, knowing there's new areas to access. Access? English. Do I know it? So it's pretty easy to guess that's no coincidence. Especially when you see the little fake Kraid start spitting So yeah, that's Super Metroid. Unless you're a pro gamer like me. Told you we'd come back to that. Why is there a screw in my garage?